Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility. And they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. The word hearsay scares a lot of parents, and honestly, I understand why. You're told over and over, don't include hearsay won't be allowed, that's hearsay, you can't use that. And what many parents hear underneath that is, your experience doesn't count unless someone else witnessed it. That interpretation is not accurate, but it's very common. So, today I want to gently untangle this, because misunderstanding hearsay causes parents to either overshare dangerously or silence themselves entirely. Neither is necessary. So let's start with something grounding. Hearsay does not mean you can't document what you observed. Hearsay is about how information is presented, not whether you're allowed to speak at all. In simple terms, hearsay is when you present someone else's statement as proof of truth, rather than as context. That distinction matters. For example, writing, the teacher said the child was anxious because of the other parent. That's hearsay and interpretation. But writing, on March 12th, the teacher emailed noticing the child appeared anxious during class. That's documentation of a communication you received, not a claim about cause. You are allowed to document what was said to you. You just don't get to present it as an established fact unless it's supported independently. And this is honestly where many parents freeze, because they think, if I can't include what people say, I can't include anything. That's not true. You can include that a conversation occurred, when it occurred, who initiated it, what the concern was, what action followed. You just don't present second-hand information as final truth. Another reason hearsay feels so threatening is because parents are often living in environments where everything happens behind closed doors. No witnesses, no recordings, no neutral observers. So when someone finally notices something, a teacher, a doctor, a coach, parents want to anchor everything to that validation. And that urge is understandable, but anchoring too hard can backfire too. Courts are cautious around documentation that relies heavily on what others said, especially when it's filtered through one parent. That doesn't mean those observations don't matter. It means you let them stand as observations, not conclusions. One of the most helpful shifts parents can make is this. Instead of documenting what someone concluded, document what prompted the conversation and what happened next. For example, instead of focusing on the opinion, you focus on the sequence. Sequence is not hearsay. Sequence is observable. Another important thing to understand is that hearsay rules apply differently depending on context. Courtroom testimony has strict rules. Documentation used for decision-making is broader. You're not writing testimony, you're creating a record. And that record helps professionals decide what questions to ask, what patterns to examine, and what follow-up is needed. Your job is not to make everything admissible. Your job is to make everything clear and usable. Parents often silence themselves because they think, if I can't prove it, I shouldn't write it. That's not true. You can document experiences without claiming certainty. You can write, a concern was raised, a report was received, a discussion occurred. Those statements don't assert truth. They assert process, and process matters. Another way parents accidentally silence themselves is by stripping all context out of entries. They write bare facts with no surrounding information, hoping to avoid hearsay entirely. But without context, documentation becomes confusing. Context is not hearsay. Interpretation is. You are allowed to say, this followed a transition. This occurred after a scheduled change. This has happened multiple times. Those are observations, not conclusions. There is also a misconception that hearsay rules mean children's statements should never be documented. That's not accurate either. Children's statements can be documented carefully as statements, not proof. You're noting that the child has said something, not asserting that that statement establishes facts. Courts are very familiar with this distinction. They simply want it handled responsibly. What courts don't respond well to is documentation that sounds like it's trying to smuggle conclusions through quotes. Long, emotionally charged quotations, especially repeated, can raise red flags. Brief, restrained noting of statements with context and without analysis is very different. Another thing parents worry about is this. What if avoiding hearsay makes my documentation weak? It doesn't. In fact, avoiding hearsay properly makes documentation stronger because it forces you to focus on what you saw, what happened next, what repeated, what changed. Those elements don't depend on anyone else's words. They stand on their own. One of the most reassuring things my attorneys told me was this. You don't need other people's voices to validate your record. Your consistency does that. That was freeing, honestly, because it meant I didn't need to quote everyone. I just needed to document clearly and calmly. The goal of documentation is not to sound legally sophisticated. We are not lawyers. The goal is to sound credible. And credibility usually sounds quieter than people expect. It sounds specific, measured, grounded, consistent over time. Not dramatic, not over-explained, not emotionally overloaded. One of the biggest mistakes parents make when they become afraid of hearsay is that they swing into extremes. Either they stop documenting entirely, or they start writing pages of emotionally charged narratives, typing to prove things indirectly. Neither approach really helps. Good documentation lives in the middle. It acknowledges uncertainty where uncertainty exists. It separates observation from interpretation, and it respects the difference between what happened and what I believe it means. That distinction alone changes how documentation is received. Another thing parents don't often realize is this. Professionals reading your records are not expecting perfection. They understand that family systems are messy. They understand that parents don't have subpoena power. They understand that many concerns emerge gradually over time. What they are watching for is whether you document responsibly. Can you stay anchored in observable reality? Can you avoid overstating? Can you tolerate ambiguity without collapsing into accusation? Those things matter more than perfectly worded entries. And honestly, one of the strongest indicators of credibility is restraint. When parents document every emotional reaction, every suspicion, every interpretation, records become noisy. But when parents Document patterns calmly, stay close to sequence, avoid overreaching, allow facts to accumulate naturally. The documentation often becomes far more persuasive. Not because it sounds aggressive, but because it sounds trustworthy. That's an important shift. You do not build credibility by sounding more convinced. You build credibility by sounding more regulated. And that's difficult when you're living under chronic stress, especially in high conflict situations where you feel constantly invalidated. Because when people keep dismissing your concerns, the nervous system naturally wants to explain harder, prove harder, argue harder. But documentation usually gets stronger when the emotional intensity goes down, not up. That doesn't mean your feelings are wrong. It means documentation serves a different purpose than emotional processing. Your journal may hold emotion. Your support system may hold emotion. Therapy may hold emotion. But court-facing documentation works best when it holds structure. That distinction protects you. Another important thing to remember is this: you're not responsible for making your documentation win your case. Parents often carry that pressure unconsciously. They believe every entry must independently prove harm, prove intent, prove motive, prove the entire story. That is not your role. Your role is to create a clear, organized, credible record of observable patterns and events. The court's role is to evaluate it. The professional's role is to investigate further when necessary. You are contributing information, not delivering verdicts. And ironically, when parents stop trying to force conclusions, their documentation often becomes far more powerful. Because calm documentation leaves room for professionals to arrive at their own conclusions. And people trust conclusions they arrive at themselves far more than conclusions forced onto them. That matters psychologically and legally. Avoiding hearsay is not about erasing your experience. It's about presenting it in a way that courts can use without an argument. You're not silencing yourself. You are translating, and translation is power. One final thing I want parents to hear. Avoiding hearsay does not mean making yourself smaller. It does not mean pretending nothing happened. It does not mean erasing concerns. And it certainly does not mean remaining silent to avoid criticism. It simply means learning how to document in a way that is sustainable, credible, and usable. That is a skill. And like any skill, it gets easier with practice. At first, many parents overcorrect. They either document too emotionally or too cautiously. But over time, you begin to recognize the balance. Clear, structured, grounded, observable. Not silent, not reactive, not performative. Just credible. And in many cases, credibility is what protects both you and your child most over the long term. So if you've been afraid to document because you were told that's hearsay or you can't say that, I hope this episode helped you understand something important. You are allowed to have a voice. You are simply learning how to use it carefully, and careful does not mean weak. Careful is often what makes documentation strong. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect, and you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.echonomorecoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.